Joe Biden may have just struck an unlikely victory, one that will have him breathing a sigh of relief. There were fears that the American president had lost control of the situation in the Middle East, lost control of his closest ally Israel. Israel has been fighting a war on three fronts against Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then there has been the long-range tennis match with Iran, the Middle East's other superpower.
اصلی خطای محاسباتی رژیم صهیونیستی باید به هم بخوره. اینا دچار خطای محاسباتی ان نسبت به ایران.
Every time Israel has made a military decision, there has been anonymous briefing here in Washington that suggests Joe Biden has been undermined, that the Israeli government has gone over his head and taken decisions without his say-so. One of those was the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, when Israel killed him during a strike in Beirut. The White House hadn't been notified before that strike, which led to suggestions that Joe Biden had been undermined or even embarrassed by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister.
The IDF will engage in extensive precise strikes against terror targets which have been embedded widely throughout Lebanon.
I'm comfortable with them stopping. We should have a ceasefire now.
Events like this triggered a nail-biting period here in Washington, with the US leaders unsure and uncertain of how Israel would plan to retaliate against a series of missile strikes from Iran. The Americans feared that whatever would come next would trigger an all-out war in the Middle East. Would Israel look to strike nuclear facilities in Iran, or maybe Iran's oil facilities? Something that would genuinely lead to an escalation.
The Israelis have not concluded what they're going to do in terms of a strike. That's under discussion. If I were in their shoes, I'd be thinking about other alternatives than striking oil fields.
To constrain Israel's response, Joe Biden, his Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have been doing shuttle diplomacy between Washington and Israel, looking for ways to stop Israel from triggering that escalation. First came the deployment of a THAAD missile defense system to Israel, with 100 US troops on the ground to man it. Secondly, the rare use of B-2 stealth bombers against Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen, which was a clear warning from the US to Iran that nothing is out of reach. When Israel eventually did strike back, Joe Biden knew exactly what was coming. He had been briefed in the hours leading up to the retaliation. Israel had promised that oil and nuclear facilities in Iran were off limits. Instead, it decided to take out missile production sites and air defences, leaving Iran's defences and offensive capabilities in tatters. Iran says the damage is limited and its response will be proportionate. But that is good news, because the threat of all-out war has essentially been taken off of the table. From the outside, it looked like Joe Biden was about to suffer one of history's great foreign policy fallouts. He had lost his influence over Israel, and the Middle East was teetering on the brink of an all-out war. Reporting would lead to suggest that Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden's relationship had hit rock bottom. There was reports of testy phone calls, swearing down the phone, even Joe Biden calling Netanyahu a lying bastard. But through careful diplomacy, Joe Biden has managed to put that relationship to the side and convince Israel that all-out war is a bad thing and that US support will only continue if Israel doesn't retaliate with full force. As Joe Biden enters his last days in office without a full-blown war in the Middle East, that is only good news for him. The uncertainty, however, continues, with Donald Trump or Kamala Harris having to pick up the precarious situation with Israel at war on three fronts.